everyone. As I continue to make these videos, I really find so much more resources and information because I can't help but dig in. I feel like I'm on the verge of finding something that can really make some kind of a difference collectively. I am such a big picture person, even though I need to stay kind of smaller picture right now because I have court in like 12 days. My baby's birthday's in 3. I have a plan, but so much keeps coming up in the interim. Just kind of taking it one day at a time. But I definitely have found out some really interesting information. So from 1990 to 2001, there were certain circumstances for murder that gave you other alternatives other than just rape, burglary, and just random things like that. Lovers' quarrel being one of them, as well as argument or conflict. So the number one murder-related cause for the death of women and children, conflict. So you can see maybe why the court adopted that, knowing what the future held. The amount of unknown circumstances and other circumstances, meaning the reason for the murder, had been increasing. So, and for 2001, which I've went through quite a few years, North Carolina Department of Public Safety Crime Statistics has detailed reports for murder by relationship from the victim to the perpetrator. There's an increase of unknown relationships and a decrease in the argument or the conflict being the cause of the death as well, but the increase of the unknown circumstances. So in 1992, the relationship between the the victim and the perpetrator, the highest amount was acquaintance. Second highest was unknown. Third was stranger. Fourth was wife. Fifth was girlfriend. Sixth was other known to victim. And I just listed those because they were most relative to what I'm trying to get at. So fast forward to 97 and 98, only 147 and 120 unknown. And at this time, they were not calling it, actually they started calling it unable to determine. So in 2001, at this point, there are 411 relationships between a victim and a perpetrator that law enforcement is just unable to determine, despite having direct knowledge of the details of 89% of the murders. And so keep going on to 2007. Now there's 600 relationships unknown between a victim and perpetrator. 2008, 500. And at the same time, the columns for all of the other relationships are decreasing. They're just all going into this unable to determine. In 2017 and 18, we're almost at 800 out of the murders in total. And we're talking about from 2011 and 2012 being almost 500 and 528 to 2017 and 18 being almost 800 of how this victim knows her abuser, her perpetrator, her murderer. In 1998, the best practices for law enforcement in North Carolina involving domestic violence addressed the domestic violence homicides rising annually. the child abuse and neglect substantiations from DSS in North Carolina were pretty much in place with the national average at this time. And the arrests of perpetrators charged with offenses against family, that means abuse, neglect, things like that, was around 9,115 in 2007. And let's see here. So 2007, we're at 9115. By 2011, we're down to 7767. So we are filing less charges. The prosecutor is prosecuting less cases. Law enforcement is investigating less abuse. And as a whole, the system and all these agencies that are receiving funding to protect, to investigate, to prosecute crimes against children and family continues to decline. And I had skipped over in 07 and 08. So in 07 we have 9115, in 08 we have 8784. 11 we have 7767, 12 7892. So the last number I'm able to access, which it is very clear that are certain years within North Carolina that something really funky happened and somebody did something drastic to make the numbers better. So by 2018, we are down, let's see how, 28% from 2007. We're down to 6,144 arrests, criminal charges for offenses against the family. Now, this is actually what the police report said when I called 911 and reported the neglect and the abuse where my child had disclosed sexual abuse to a medical provider. Now, the investigation had been referred to Winston-Salem Police Department and DSS in Forsyth, but I didn't have a lot of faith. And that's what the document actually says. Offenses against family. However, that was never actually investigated. So now we're at 2018, we're down 3,000 from where we were for these children, that their abuse and neglect and their suffering is actually getting acknowledged and they're getting protected from it. So not only is child abuse and neglect, and now I'm just back to Forsyth County, specifically abuse and neglect, is not being investigated, or is it being substantiated in Forsyth County for DSS? At the same time, law enforcement is not taking it seriously, even though they are funded to take it seriously. They're funded to step in with authority and take domestic violence and acts of child abuse and things like that. Even little things like property damage, because they all add up, to understand that once a victim leaves, the lethality level is the highest it's ever going to be, and she risks death, and so do her children. In 98, the best practices for law enforcement involving domestic violence was for law enforcement to take acts of domestic violence as far as arresting the perpetrator, which they can do without a warrant. They can also enter into a residence without a warrant for extenuating circumstances, exigent circumstances. If we have proof that your child's being abused, if she risks further harm, they can step in and do something. In Forsyth County and a lot of other places, according to what a lot of moms have told me, law enforcement is completely it's a dereliction of all duty. It's basically treating domestic violence victims like they're just throwaway and putting us into a category because we were most likely, and not most likely, but a lot of the time we're never married to the child's father. And the law enforcement officers in place that have been basically handpicked to support this narrative of not helping victims and not prosecuting criminals to be able to profit off of it and make their job easier. Because we left the abuse, that makes us not being abused. statistics and the national average, and all these women that are being murdered and their children that are being murdered, these murder suicides and things like this by former partners. That's something that I'm going to get to in a minute as you know, really the main reason for all of this, and not just a local police practice. So, in 2011 in North Carolina, at least 13 victims were murdered by an ex. And in 2011, at least 13 victims had applied for a domestic violence protective order prior to the homicide. That is something else that needs to be highlighted. If we don't have a database that shows how many domestic violence homicide victims or victims of violent crimes actually attempted to obtain a domestic violence protective order and address trying to protect her children, of course she's going to have to address this in family court. And if she is dealing with corruption and injustices and a lack of integrity or moral conscience within the court officials and appointees, like in my case, I got a protective order in another jurisdiction and then another state, despite facts of my child being assaulted, abused, all these things, because a corrupt Department of Social Services under Victor Eisler. But, you know, that's not negating the fact that there are numerous other counties in North Carolina that the numbers don't match the suffering. The funding doesn't match the continued suffering of the victims and the apparent success when we're looking at statistics. So looking at some of the reporting, it's very clear that despite numerous times where there's over 100 victims, there's only ever between 3 and 8 reported domestic violence protective orders for the victims. And so if there is no way for us to verify that a victim, a murder victim, a domestic violence victim, which obviously we're trying to say she's not a domestic violence victim or else she'd be protected. If there's no database that shows how many protective orders were applied for and denied, why are we reporting it? It seems like it's very common that every news story that I see that involves a woman and children being killed, she had went to try to get a protective order and was denied. And women coming to get protective orders about abusive men post-separation, fearing for their child's safety, are not being taken seriously. And there are many reasons why we're not being taken seriously. Of course, there's, you know, a patriarchy in society, a lot of people that are in power that have no life experience when it comes to trauma, nor do they know any victims of any kind of abuse. They tend to think, especially males, that women make up these allegations, that they make up domestic violence stories. My thing is, if we're so many years or whatever into the custody case, why all of a sudden, as women, do you think that we just decided to add some more court dates on? I mean, the numbers don't lie until you're North Carolina. Then they do when you list the wrong relationship with the victim and the perpetrator. But I'm definitely going to highlight that in a minute. So in 2011, 15 children under the age of 15 were murdered by a domestic violence abuser. In 2011, there were 73 acknowledged domestic violence homicides. 57 of those were female. 16 were male. And of the male victims, and the reporting for NCCADV, which is the domestic violence reporting for North Carolina, versus the North Carolina Department of Public Safety, and NCDHHS, which actually reports to the government so we can continue the stream of money for suffering. It doesn't differentiate between the sexes of the victims and the ages. So North Carolina combined suicides of elderly men and homicides of young children by domestic abusers. Like, they're all in the same category. So of these 16 male victims, 6 were children. And the remainder of the male DV homicide victims were in same-sex relationships for the most part. We're talking 85%. Okay, so if NCDHHS subverts numbers to falsely assert that men are being killed, many times the amount of women being killed, by using age groups 40 to 75 with a male category and only female categories for ages 0 to 40. So I'm not sure if they thought that no one would ever catch that, but if you want a good laugh, go to NCDHHS for, what's it called? It is basically the system in which murders are reported or violent deaths are reported for the state. But obviously the numbers aren't legitimately reported. Okay. Something with the drastic decline of domestic violence homicides in the offending counties, in addition to the misrepresentation of statistics for domestic violence homicide, beginning in 2009 for NCDPS. So the domestic violence homicide rate in Guilford, Forsyth, Wake, Mecklenburg, Raleigh, possibly Buncombe, Cabarrus, but the first few, yes. In 2008, the numbers of domestic violence homicides was just exploding. It was increasing and it was getting out of control. That is also the time that Children's Law Center was incepted into Forsyth County local government as a federally funded pilot program to obviously address this issue. So what do you know, the next year, all the domestic violence homicides within Forsyth and Guilford County were just cut in half, as well as Charlotte and Raleigh and Wake. All of them just next year, bam, half the amount of domestic violence murders. Even though the events of domestic violence, the acts of domestic violence, and the murder rate overall in the country has gone up exponentially. So North Carolina DPS is the responsible agency for distributing the massive amount of federal funding and awards to each of the agencies within the government of the state. And currently, NCDPS is asserting only having $10 million for child victims available this year. And around 2001, the legitimate and the realistic information about the actual dollar amounts distributed to who, why, when is no longer available after that year to the public on Google. So I did a little bit of math, and I calculated up the population, inflation, the statistics for domestic violence and abuse, and the homicide rates. If offensive violence against women and the DOJ and the OVP and the OJP is providing like $100 million in 2001 for domestic violence victims and abused children, I think it's safe to assume that that number has continued to be available, if not increased exponentially as well. If NCDPS is only acknowledging $10 million for victims, and law enforcement has adopted practices in Forsyth County that deny having authority and having any option to assist domestic violence survivors who have left and obtain safety for their abused child, even though North Carolina law assures law enforcement assistance to do everything that they're denying the ability to do. They're also recipients of massive federal funding specifically to assist domestic violence survivors and their children. By law enforcement adopting the opinion that family court is the only way to protect a child in these situations, that DSS is responsible and that they have no authority to act at the same time the court isn't cooperating with humanity, justice, or truth, and fraud and abuse are the only acceptable way to proceed, and it's encouraged. And then conflict is an actual category of a cause of death, and it's actually the #1 recognized category in the state of North Carolina for the death of children. Conflict. So when the court actors call this high conflict, obviously they know what the future holds. Giving custody of a defenseless child to a father that's not fit, knowing that they're putting the child in danger and the father has a history of abuse. And then also DSS, knowingly not substantiating severe abuses and focusing on the safe parent that's actually doing the right thing. And then the guardian ad litem appointed for child abuse and neglect, knowing that none of it's ever going to be substantiated, and they pretty much, it's open season on the protective mother. They get to create conflict, the cause of death of children. It's funny that North Carolina recognizes conflict as a cause of death. And then we've got the court denying domestic violence protective orders because she's not a domestic violence victim. She's not even with this man. And then law enforcement refusing and failing to investigate any offenses against the family. And then we have attorneys indifferent. They're not making reports as mandatory reporters for abuse because they're probably aware that nobody's going to care. It's not going to be substantiated. We're going to line our pockets with the blood of child abuse and domestic violence survivors and look the other way. And it appears as though those in authority and authoritative and powerful positions and the people making these decisions were intentionally chosen specifically for their character. So the homicide rates nationally are increasing major. The acts of domestic violence have increased in a major way, but the domestic violence murders have decreased, and the average, the murder and suicide rates as a whole have increased in a major way. There's also still a large portion of these victims that are females that were killed by gun violence. We're just putting them in a different category now. So if every person with the ability to protect, investigate, and recognize and issue court orders has decided that under no circumstances are you ever to be recognized as a domestic violence survivor, despite the data strongly indicating that post-separation domestic violence is more lethal for women and children than any other point in a relationship, and that daily news on women and her children being murdered by the child's father after she was denied a protective order. And I mean, that's like every single story I hear. My question is that if the dead cannot speak, apparently, obviously, whose word are you taking as a fact when learning of the relationship between the victim and the perpetrator? Who are these law enforcement officers who are ordered to report this data when they are answering for the state whether or not this woman who is deceased had a protective order, which most likely no, because they don't get granted, especially when in family court. And these court actors don't believe domestic violence happens post-separation because it would not be very lucrative for them if it were to be. And so if a woman that was a victim of domestic violence, obviously she's deceased now and a man killed her. That indicates that there was some violence before that. If we're asking the perpetrator or others that knew her what their relationship was, and she is a victim of domestic violence, number one, nobody's really going to know what's going on in their relationship. Number two, she's most likely been isolated. Number three, he might have triangulated her relationships and she might not be speaking to anybody about what's been going on. The understanding of a woman being killed by a man is the fact that she was taking her power back and removing control from him over her life by ending the relationship, by saying that she's no longer going to allow that treatment. He panics as an abusive man, finding a way to where he can take that power and control back. And I think that if we were going to have a database or to come up with the actual number of domestic violence murder victims and their children, who the mother was involved in family court proceedings, that there had been years of evidence of domestic violence and that she was denied protective orders, I think that would be very helpful. In addition to a real database of how many of these victims, when relating to the perpetrator, actually had children in common, because we're relying on an investigating officer for a woman's death to know if they had children together and what their relationship was, obviously, and what the reason of killing her was. Because if we can just put lovers' quarrel or conflict, I think that's some bull. So as the father's rights movement and shared parenting and mothers begin losing custody on a global level, it appears as though judges, attorneys, and other unscrupulous actors in the court get a taste of the constant conflict and all of its benefits. As the domestic violence, child homicides, and domestic violence, suicide, murders increase, and you see them on a daily basis, the federal funding from the Violence Against Women and etc. pour in to address the crisis. Those abusing power, knowing if we actually give her the respect, protection, and justice her and the children deserve, substantiate the abuse, and give her a protective order, the child support incentives, gone. We know he's not going to pay, and we're going to have to chase him around. There'll be no more revolving courthouse door of conflict. There just goes your money, and all of these ways, all of these reasons are why we are not able to get the respect and justice we deserve, because of greed and power and control. And so if law enforcement would actually have to help victims and not pretend that they don't have the authority, obviously their costs will probably go up and their training requirements might need to go up. But then all those 911 calls and all of those DV calls that they get funding for would probably not be constantly occurring with no kind of acknowledgement or prevention. So no more DSS in-home services, no more constant court actions. So there will be way less of a demand for family law attorneys, and they wouldn't be so terrible, probably. As domestic violence victims, we would get legal aid and we'd get free legal assistance, which actually, within the confines of the federal funding for domestic violence, we're already supposed to have legal assistance. But in North Carolina, they've decided that because of the conflict, I don't get any legal assistance and I'm denied any kind of right, all rights altogether. So yeah. If they actually used the hundreds of millions of dollars to help protect, support, and encourage victims and children, imagine what the next generation could be like instead of the growing number of 10 to 14-year-olds that are committing suicide that is growing on a yearly basis after being forced to be in the custody of an abuser. Obviously, their abuse, their sexual abuse, their neglect, the lack of acknowledgement of their suffering and their mother's suffering, in addition to be in an abuser's care who is behaving completely unhealthy and in a really inappropriate, dangerous way, most likely being violent with another partner, and the ACEs scores are through the roof. Children end up being abused or being abusers. on drugs, having health problems, having psychosocial and psychological issues. And then we will have a repeating generational cycle of curses of our children in the next generation choosing poor relationships and having poor outcomes of life. And I really need that to end, as well as a million other moms, because it's time for profit to stop being made off of something that we have the ability to address and correct, to where we would actually be able to have some peace and this world could become a better place instead of a world filled with suffering, where children's voices are snuffed out, quieted, perverted, prevented from speaking, giving them, no safety and no kind of innocence. Their innocence has been stolen. And for most of these children, there is no getting that back. And there's nothing that you could pay or do to give it back. As a whole, I do feel as though all of these actors that have been exploiting and capitalizing upon suffering and murder and just horrible suffering altogether, pain, they need to be completely removed from their position of authority, and they need to be known for what they have done intentionally. There's people who are negligent. There's people who are unknowingly involved. There's a difference. So I'd like to acknowledge that difference. So in order to maintain the appearance of legitimacy and a need for what is offered, there will be no law enforcement help for victims of children, no DSS help or substantiations, no law enforcement investigating child abuse, no domestic violence protective order for mom or custody. And then they slander mom, portray her as mentally ill, drain her, create the conflict by refusing to offer any kind of safety or protection for the victims as required for the federal funds to get there. They will never call it domestic violence or abuse. It's high conflict. They pretend that these DV abuse funds are going to the victims, or it's actually lowering the number of domestic violence homicides, when actually the data is being manipulated to conceal facts based on the relationship of the perpetrator and the victim, and as well as the circumstances surrounding it. So 2008, DV murders are increasing, murder-suicides and children murder were increasing. Looking at the first part of the 2021 data, the relationship of unknown and being called between the relationship between the perpetrator and the victim. Calling it a partner, saying it's not offered, and say it's unknown. If we have a murder that is not an unsolved mystery, you don't get to say unknown, not offered, or just partner. Do your job. And this is something that's going to have to be acknowledged. This law that requires law enforcement to report the relationship obviously is a local practice to don't report it, because if we do report it, we're going to have to stop all of these cruel and unusual punishments for these mothers and children. We'll have to do our job, and we'll have less of a country club weekend, and maybe have to hire some officials with integrity and hold others accountable. So really not in their best interest, right? The actors are aware of this increase in the murders. They're not correcting it. It's not made public. It's, I'd like to see if there is a way to learn and make it public knowledge to see, out of all of these domestic violence homicides, which of these were litigants in family court? Which of these were denied a domestic violence protective order? Which of these women were denied DV resources and legal assistance? And also, which one of these victims were denied assistance from law enforcement? And which one of these victims' civil and constitutional rights have been violated by those in power? If there are no arrests and there are no victims, that's a win for cruel, greedy abusers of power. They get to keep all the money and the recognition for lowering numbers, all while engaging in a corrupt organization under the guise of legitimacy to profit off of federal crimes. And what the funding is there for is being ignored and subverted. And I do believe that based on the last few years of chaos and melee that we as a country have endured, that this situation has been perpetuated so much more. But obviously it's been going on since around 01, uptick in 08. Like in the 80s and 90s, this was not happening, but there's obviously some incentives